clothes, he lurched away from the remains of the Forsaken. He tried to use both hands and fell forward. A sheer drop loomed under his face, a smooth rock wall spinning in his eyes, depth pulling him. His head swum, and he vomited over the edge of the cliff. Trembling, he crawled backwards on his belly until there was solid stone under his eyes, then flopped over onto his back, panting for breath. With an effort, he fumbled his sword from its scabbard. Only a few ashes remained from the red cloth. His hands shook when he held it up in front of his face. It took both hands. It was a heron-marked blade. Heron-mark? Yes. Tam, my father. But only steel for that. He needed 3 wavering tries to sheath it again. It had been something else. Or there was another sword. My name, he said after a while, is Randall Thor. More memory crashed back into his head like a lead ball, and he groaned. The Dark One, he whispered to himself. The Dark One is dead. There was no more need for caution. Shaitan is dead. The world seemed to lurch. He shook in silent mirth until tears poured from his eyes. Shaitan is dead! He laughed at the sky. Other memories. Egwene! That name meant something important. Painfully, he got to his feet, wavering like a willow in a high wind, and staggered past Agenor's ashes without looking at them. Not important anymore. He fell more than climbed down that first steep part of the slope, tumbling and sliding from bush to bush. By the time he reached more level ground, his bruises ached twice as much, but he found strength enough to stand, barely. Egwene. He broke into a shambling run. Leaves and flower petals showered around him as he blundered through the undergrowth. Have to find her. Who is she? His arms and legs seemed to flail about more like long blades of grass than go as he wanted them to. Tottering, he fell against a tree, slamming against the trunk so hard that he grunted. Foliage rained on his head while he pressed his face to the rough bark, clutching to keep from falling. Egwene. He pushed himself away from the tree and hurried on. Almost immediately he tilted again, falling, but he forced his legs to work faster, to run into the fall so that he was staggering along at a good clip, all the while one step from falling flat on his face. Moving made his legs begin to obey him more. Slowly he found himself running upright, arms pumping, long legs pulling him down the slope in leaps. He bounded into the clearing, half filled now by the great oak marking the green man's grave. There was the white stone arch marked with the ancient symbol of the Aes Sedai, and the blackened, gaping pit where fire and wind had tried to trap Agenor and failed. Egwene! Egwene, where are you? A pretty girl looked up with big eyes from where she knelt beneath the spreading branches, flowers in her hair, and brown oak leaves. She was slender and young and frightened. Yes, that's who she is. Of course. Egwene, thank the light you're all right. There were 2 other women with her, one with haunted eyes and a long braid, still decorated with a few white morning stars. The other lay outstretched, her head pillowed on folded cloaks, her own sky-blue cloak not quite hiding her tattered dress. Charred spots in the rich cloth showed, and her face was pale, but her eyes were open. Moraine. Yes, the Aes Sedai. And the wisdom Nynaeve. All 3 women looked at him, unblinking and intent. You are all right, aren't you, Egwene? He didn't harm you. He could walk without stumbling now. The sight of her made him feel like dancing, bruises and all. But it still felt good to drop down cross-legged beside them. I never even saw him after you pushed. Her eyes were uncertain on his face. What about you, Rand? I'm fine, he laughed. He touched her cheek and wondered if he had imagined a slight pulling away. A little rest and I'll be new maid. Nynaeve? Moraine Sedai? The names felt new in his mouth. The wisdom's eyes were old, ancient in her young face, but she shook her head. A little bruised, she said.
Sleep right at the top of
We
the
got to
ladder,
change
she
the
said.
book.
Elaine channeled to extinguish the lamp. After a
My
time
bad,
lying in
everyone.
the dark, she said, The palace seemed so empty, Nynaeve. It felt so empty. Nynaeve did not know what else a place was supposed to be in Tel Iran Riod. It was the terangrial you used. You looked almost foggy to me. Well, I looked just fine to me. There was only a touch of asperity in Elaine's voice, though, and they settled down to sleep. Nynaeve had remembered the other woman's elbows accurately, but they could not diminish her good mood, and neither could Elaine's complaining murmur that she had cold feet. She had done it. Perhaps forgetting to be afraid was not the same as not being afraid, but at least she had gone back to the world of dreams. Perhaps one day she could find the nerve again not to be afraid. Having begun, it was easier to go on than to stop. Every night after that they entered Tel Rhiod together, always with a visit to the tower to see what they could learn. There was not very much, besides an order sending an emissary to Salidar to invite the Aes Sedai there to return to the tower. Except the invitation, as much as Nynaeve could read before it changed to a report on screening potential novices for proper attitudes, whatever that was supposed to mean, was more a demand that those Aes Sedai submit to Elaida immediately and be thankful they were allowed to. Still, it was confirmation that they were not chasing a wild hare. The trouble with the rest of what they saw in fragments was they did not know enough to fit them together. Who was this Davram Bashir, and why was Elaida so frantic to find him? Why had Elaida forbidden anyone to mention the name of Mazrim Time, the false dragon, with a threat of stiff penalties? Why had Queen Tenobia of Saldaea and King Isar of Shinar both written letters politely but stiffly resenting White Tower meddling in their affairs? It all made Elaine murmur one of Linny's sayings, "To know two, you must first know one." Nynaeve could only agree that it certainly seemed so. Aside from the trips to Elaida's study, they worked at learning control of themselves and their surroundings in the world of dreams. Nynaeve did not mean to let herself be caught again as she had been by Egwene and by the Wise Ones. Mogadine she tried not to think about. Much better to concentrate on the Wise Ones. Of Egwene's trick of appearing in their dreams, as she had in Samara, they could puzzle out nothing. Calling her did nothing except increase that uneasy feeling of being watched, and she did not make another such appearance. Trying to hold somebody else in Tel Rhiod was incredibly frustrating, even after Elaine hit on the trick, which was to see the other as just another part of the dream. Elaine did it finally, and Nynaeve congratulated her with as good grace as she could muster, but for days Nynaeve could not. Elaine might as well have been the near mist she seemed, vanishing with a smile whenever she chose. When Nynaeve finally managed to fasten Elaine there, she felt the strain as if she were picking up a boulder. Creating fantastical flowers or shapes by thinking of them was much more fun. The effort involved seemed related to both how large the thing was and whether it might really exist. Trees covered with wildly shaped blossoms in red and gold and purple were harder to make than a stand mirror to examine what you had done to your dress, or what the other woman had done to it. A gleaming crystal palace rising out of the ground was harder still, and even if it felt solid to the touch, it changed whenever the image in your mind wavered, and vanished as soon as the image did. They quietly decided to leave animals alone after a peculiar thing, much like a horse with a horn on its nose, chased them both up a hill before they could make it vanish. That very nearly sparked a new argument, with each of them claiming the other had made it. But by that time Elaine had recovered enough of her old self to start giggling over how they must have looked, racing up the hill with their skirts hauled up, shouting at the thing to go away. Even Elaine's stubborn refusal to admit it had been her fault could not stop Nynaeve's giggles from bubbling up, too. Elaine alternated between the iron disc and the apparently amber plaque with its carving of a sleeping woman, but she did not really like using either terangrial. As hard as she worked with them, she did not feel as fully in Tel Rhiod as with the ring, and each did have to be worked. It was not possible to tie the flow of spirit, or you bounced right back out of the world of dreams immediately. Channeling anything else at the same time seemed all but impossible, yet Elaine could not understand why. She seemed more interested in how they had been made, and not at all pleased that they did not yield their secrets as easily as the Idam. Not knowing the why was a burr in her stocking. Once Nynaeve tried one of the pair, coincidentally on the night they were to meet Egwene, the night after leaving Boanda. She would not have been angry enough if not for the thing that rubbed her wrong so often: men. Neras began it, stumping around the deck as the sun began to sink, muttering to himself about having his cargo stolen. She ignored him, of course. Then Tom, making up his bed at the foot of the aftermast, said quietly, "He has a point." It was plain he did not see her in the fading lurid light, and neither did Juilin, squatting beside him. He's a smuggler, but he did pay for those goods. Nynaeve had no right to seize them. A woman's flaming rights are whatever she flaming says they are, Uno laughed. That's what women in Shinar say, anyway. That was when they saw her and fell silent, as usual, finding wisdom too late. Uno rubbed at his cheek, the one without a scar. He had removed his bandages that day, and he knew now what had been done. She thought he looked embarrassed. It was hard to tell in the fast-shifting shadows, but the other two seemed to have no expression at all. She did nothing to them, of course, only stalked away with a firm grip on her braid. She even managed to stalk down the ladder. Elaine already had the iron disc in her hand. The dark wooden box sat open on the table. Nynaeve picked up the yellowish plaque carved inside with a sleeping woman. It felt slick and soft, not at all something that would scratch metal. With that edge of anger smoldering inside her, saidar was a warm glow just out of sight over her shoulder. "Maybe I can come up with some idea why this thing won't let you channel anything but dribbles." Which was how she found herself in the heart of the stone, channeling a flow of spirit into the plaque, which in Tel'aran'rhiod was tucked into her belt pouch. As she often did in the world of dreams, Elaine wore a gown suitable for her mother's court, green silk embroidered in gold around the neck, with a necklace and bracelets of gold links and moonstones. But Nynaeve was surprised to discover that she herself had on something not very different, though her hair was in a braid, and its own color, instead of loose about her shoulders. Her gown was pale blue and silver, and if not so low as Luca's dresses, still lower than she thought she would have chosen. Still, she liked the way the single fire drop on its silver chain looked gleaming between her breasts. Egwene would not be easy to bully a woman dressed so. Certainly not that that could have had anything to do with why she had donned it, even unconsciously. Right away she saw what Elaine had meant about looking just fine. To herself she appeared no different than the other woman who had the twisted stone ring somehow threaded onto her necklace. Elaine, however, said she looked misty. Misty was how saidar felt too, except for the flow of spirit she had begun to weave while awake. The rest was thin, and even the never-seen warmth of the true source seemed muted. Her anger remained just strong enough for her to channel. If irritation at the men faded before the puzzle, that puzzle was its own irritant. Steeling herself to confront Egwene had no part in it. She was not steeling herself at all, and there was no reason for the faint taste of boiled catfern and powdered maven's leaf on her tongue. Yet producing a single flame, dancing in mid-air, one of the first things a novice was taught, seemed as difficult as throwing Lan over her shoulder. The flame looked attenuated even to her, and as soon as she tied the weave, it began to fade away. In seconds it was gone. "Both of you," Amis said. She and Egwene were just there on the other side of Kalandor, both in Aiel skirts and blouses and shawls. At least Egwene had not donned so many necklaces and bracelets. "Why do you appear so strange, Nynaeve? Have you learned to come waking?" Nynaeve gave a little jump. She did so hate people sneaking up on her. "Egwene, how did you—" she began, smoothing her skirts, at the same time that Elaine said, "Egwene, we can't understand how you—" Egwene broke in. "Rand and the Aiel have won a great victory at Cairhien." Out it all came in a torrent, everything she had told them in their dreams, from Samael to the Shanshan spearhead. Each word almost tripped over the next, and she drove everyone home with an intense stare. Nynaeve exchanged confused glances with Elaine. Surely she had told them. They could not have imagined it, not with every word confirmed now. Even Anis, long white hair only emphasizing the not quite Aes Sedai agelessness of her face, looked amazed at the flood. Mat killed Couladin? Nynaeve exclaimed at one point. That had certainly not been in their dreams of her. It did not sound like Mat at all. Leading soldiers? Mat? When Egwene finally trailed off, shifting her shawl and breathing a little quickly, she had barely paused for breath along the way, Elaine said weakly, "Is he well?" She sounded as if she was almost beginning to doubt her own memories. "As well as can be expected," Anis said. "He drives him